So we finally got to see Dune.
We did, yeah, finally.
It
I know
took
it's a
us-
bit late,
Yeah, I mean,
but
with
we were busy shopping in Target outside of Boston. So, we're back
tour
now.
of Targets throughout the nation.
That's
for a
what we did
honeymoon.
for the whole trip.
So,
honestly, wouldn't be the worst.
But we looked forward to this movie for years, and it was obviously delayed for, I don't know, it seemed like 2 years.
It
because
felt
of the
like
pandemic.
it was delayed for 10 years.
Yeah.
I know that's not true, but that's how it felt.
So we finally got to see it. We missed the IMAX window, but, who cares?
I care. I have lots of thoughts about that.
No, but I mean, the director is so good, and we love the director so much. Like, I knew he was going to have a huge scope.
Yeah.
And a visually beautiful, enjoyable, immersive experience.
Yes.
This is the director's Denis Villeneuve, who did the first Sicario. He did Enemy, Prisoners, the new Blade Runner. He's unfairly talented.
I know, and I'm bummed that we didn't see this in a theater. We watched it at home, which was like still great, but especially like with the sound, when a movie is clearly not mixed to be watched on a TV at home, you have to like adjust the volume by 30 levels every 5 minutes. That was a bit disappointing. I mean, I've experienced that with movies before, but this one was so, it's so dumb to call a movie cinematic.
No, but
it was so like,
yeah.
Like I didn't want to, like I wanted to be in a theater. Most of the time I can get over it and I can just enjoy the movie. But this one I was like, I wish I was seeing this in a theater.
Well,
but
he was openly mad at the studio.
Yeah, he was.
When it was going to be day and date on HBO Max. And obviously they mixed it, I assume, a year ago when it was supposed to come out for theater. I don't know if they went back and remixed it for like because I know they do that sometimes.
It doesn't sound like they did.
Right.
which was disappointing. I mean, again, that's just, it's not even about convenience. It's just about, I know this is not how the creator wanted me to experience this, and that's frustrating.
But luckily it's still getting the sequel, and I looked in the IMAX near us. Yeah. Is bringing it back in early December.
Are you serious? Wait.
They're going to have a second window.
Well, I wish we'd just waited then.
Well, we could just see it again. So let's jump into something.
Okay, well, that's cool. Yeah, we're not going to... Are we going to spoil anything? We should say that off the bat.
No, I'm going to make overture comparisons and maybe a couple little jokes, but nothing big.
Yeah, I don't... So if you haven't seen it, stop listening and watch. But still, like, we won't spoil anything.
The point for me of covering this on this show is that there is a ton of crossover with the stuff we've imprinted on our entire lives. Not just Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, there's Star Wars. There's everything.
any hero's journey story.
Any major franchise that we've been way too invested in.
Yeah.
This is another one of those.
Yeah, of course.
And I love this director. He's done like really screwed up crime movies and action-y movie, like great adult dramas, I guess you'd call them. Even the ones that veer into genre territory are still very much adult drama movies, even if they have different looking scenery.
Right.
But I was expecting to enjoy this on that level.
Me too, which is why I was so excited, because I knew this director, and like just the way that the trailers had been painting this, I knew it wasn't going to be... I mean, it's like Star Wars in plot, but in theme, but I knew it wasn't going to be like Star Wars. I mean, Villeneuve described it as Star Wars for adults, which is exactly what this is.
Which is also the history of the property. The book was published in 1965, and George Lucas has talked about pulling a lot of things from Dune. And
there's so much crossover.
But and it's not, I don't think that's... necessarily a bad thing. He remixed it to be this like perfect piece of pop culture. Yeah, where this is obviously more difficult and allegorical and all these other elements to it.
Yes, and Star Wars has like a goofiness to it and a funness to it that Dune does not have.
We can start there, actually. I have some points on that, and then I'll go back to what I was saying before.
Oh, I didn't mean to derail you, sorry.
No, it's fine. This is looser. So I titled this section in my notes, Getting a Reference Backwards.
Okay.
Because... I was understanding the Star Wars things, but so out of turn. And I know I'm doing that all the time in the Lord of the Rings episodes because that has just been such a titan of influence throughout the rest of movies and especially the fantasy works we grew up with and loved. But this is big with Star Wars. And you didn't, but I did grow up with Star Wars.
Yeah.
I mean, I loved the original trilogy. That was all, VHS at the time and DVD. But I saw all the prequel trilogy as they came out. and I was extremely excited for them.
Yeah, sorry.
And then obviously I saw all the most recent 3 and Solo and Rogue One, all the Disney ones. I saw all those the day they came out, and I was excited, even when I didn't like some of them. I mean, Solo I thought was a fantastic movie.
Yeah.
Rogue One was great.
Yeah.
The rest are a little mixed.
Right. I feel like I should give my background. I did not watch Star Wars growing up because I wasn't interested. I've never been a big sci-fi person. I don't know what it is, because I love fantasy and I love imagined worlds. I think it's just when it's a gun that goes pew pew, I stop caring. I like when it's swords. But I did, I've now seen, I think, most of the Star Wars movies, and they're just like, they're fine. Like I get why people like them. It's fun. It's whatever for me. I'm very neutral on it. But I really enjoyed this. And I think it's because there's a sword and not a lightsaber. I'm not kidding. That makes a big difference for me.
your aesthetics are pretty important to you. But I think for me to get really invested in a franchise, it's important that I have a framework for understanding it. And usually, like with Tolkien or with Game of Thrones, there's a lot of Shakespeare in there. And that's my wheelhouse. That's how I understand things. That's where I'm comfortable.
Well, yes, and this felt very Shakespearean.
This was basically the arc of Henry IV, parts 1 and 2. And then the second movie seems like it's going to go into Henry V.
Oh, okay.
Because all of those plays are sequential, the history plays.
Yes.
And Henry IV, part 1 starts with Hal, who's this young, like, upstart, and his dad's the king. And by the time his dad eventually, kicks the bucket and he becomes king, he becomes Henry V.
Yes.
But he's just Hal in Henry IV. So I was really comfortable with that basis, and it felt like it was commenting on a lot of other pop culture sort of genre franchise-y things too. I forgot where I was going with that.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
Do you want to pause?
No, we can just go back to the Star Wars thing.
Oh, okay. I could see you starting to lose it. I was like, I don't know what to do.
Just that I wasn't thinking I was going to feel moored to the story like that.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I wasn't expecting Shakespeare. I wasn't expecting the same tinglies I get at Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter.
So you found surprised by it then? Found yourself surprised by it?
I was overwhelmed by how much I enjoyed this movie and how much there was to dig into.
Yeah.
Because I thought it was either going to be surface level, accessible, fun, raunchy sci-fi like
Lots
Star
of
Wars.
Action, wee, pew, pew, yeah.
I didn't expect to dig into it on like a Shakespeare level.
Yeah.
Because that's what my brain does to stuff, or Faustus, you guys know that. And I didn't expect to be able to do that, but I caught all of these little Star Wars comparisons, and almost the mini game of comparing those things in my head was enough to keep my brain alive the entire movie.
Well, yeah, and because it takes all those great concepts from Star Wars. Well, it doesn't really take it because it came first, but it's those great concepts from Star Wars, but it actually digs into it. Like the whole thing about like Luke and like wanting to like not knowing who he is or who his parents are and like wanting to become something big or whatever. That's like, I feel like it's only surface level addressed in Star Wars. Whereas here, like you really dig into his relationship with his father and like what he's going to become and like who he thinks he is. And it's dug into a lot more because there's space for it. It's not just, well, all right, that character moment's over. Time for another lightsaber fight, Yeah.
And maybe like the easiest example of that was they wear these little like suits that protect them, like shields. Almost if a shield was an exoskeleton.
Yeah, because they're like on this desert planet that's super hot and dangerous.
So it like glows blue when you turn it on. And then if someone hits you hard enough to like pierce the shield and kill you,
that's a different thing.
It flashes red.
I'm thinking of something else. Sorry.
I've done that part in your head.
Well, no, I didn't want to sound wrong.
So the characters flashing blue or red, you can see how that goes through the like light prism and comes out as lightsabers.
Yeah.
You make it an easier, more accessible, more merchandisable version of that story, but the character work was fascinating because you take the character of Obi-Wan, who exists as this father, Jedi master, mentor figure, and again, pulling this reference backwards, in Dune, you take the Obi-Wan role to Luke, which in this case is to Paul, and you split that role between Paul's parents.
Yes, right.
So the dad has the expectations, the legacy, like the difficult relationship boys have with their father.
Yeah, and all the political stuff of like being a leader and stuff like that.
Yeah, and the legacy part of like living up to that. But then the mom becomes the Jedi Master part, where she's kind of teaching Luke the Force. And because it's a direct family tie and not some like pseudo uncle, it's a totally different experience because you're invoking that gender flip.
Yes.
Because the dad is there doing part of that work, but I would say the majority of the breakdown goes to the mom.
Yeah.
So it's a completely different dynamic.
Yeah. Well, and then you have moments where because Paul is this like adolescent becoming a man, and because of the gender thing, you have moments where it seems like Paul is protecting his mother. And so it's not just like Obi-Wan like being this overarching mentor figure that's protecting Luke and teaching him. It's now Luke is protecting Obi-Wan in this version, and that's really interesting.
And there's the other remix of Duncan Idaho, who's Jason Momoa's character. He's basically the Han Solo.
Yeah.
But in this version, he has that like Falstaffian sort of uncle relationship with Paul. And they're really good, healthy friends as well, instead of that like arm's length, sarcastic rogue Han Solo thing. So it's enough that you can enjoy the comparison, but you're also still really intrigued by the differences. I feel like that's a really tough needle to thread because everyone saying this will have some familiarity with those other franchises. And I was here. Skip the next 15 seconds if you don't want to be spoiled. The fun part for me was when Han Solo became Hedwig halfway through the movie.
Yeah, I know. I was so... Well, there are a lot... I won't get into it. There are a lot of characters that died that I was like, oh man, I wanted them to stick around because they were so good. Just again, Star Wars would never. So it took them 12 movies to kill Han Solo. So
welcome back. I'm just guessing that was 15 seconds.
It was probably like 10.
There's also a character who's basically the Jabba the Hutt of this sand planet, which instead of Tatooine is called Arrakis.
Yes.
There's like a trial by combat, which pulls in some Game of Thrones stuff.
Well, yeah, a lot of this felt very Game of Thrones. A lot of the political stuff felt, which, I mean, and Game of Thrones feels Shakespearean. So that's full circle.
And again, we're getting the reference backwards, but this is undoubtedly an influence on George R.R. Martin.
Oh, absolutely.
And
yes.
I didn't look it up. I do have a section on Tolkien for later, who did make some comments about Dune.
Cool.
But I'm sure George R.R. Martin has talked about Dune.
Sure. Well, and I'm sure also that in making this movie in a post-Game of Thrones world, I'm sure they saw the success of, wow, you can dig into the political intrigue. And
there's an appetite for it.
Yes, and it can be like interesting and engaging for a wide audience. Like,
what's the number one show on TV right now? Succession.
Right, exactly.
Which would be like this movie without any of the cool costumes or sandworms.
Exactly, yeah. So I love that they dug into the political stuff on an adult level because, again, Star Wars, which it has a slightly different audience, and it's just trying to accomplish something different. I'm not trying to place value judgment. I'm just saying I prefer this one. Star Wars doesn't really dig into the political stuff. There's a vague, okay, there's an empire and it's bad.
Yeah.
But this like actually is complicated and nuanced and much more like real life and real history.
My first impression as the credits rolled on this movie that I was sort of getting to before we hit the Star Wars thing, I had this really rare feeling of being satisfied but really, really excited. Like I was falling in love with the whole world. Not like I just watched a movie, but this was a whole world. I wanted to be familiar with the source material. I was anxious for the next movie.
Which is how we felt with like Game of Thrones and Harry Potter and
I haven't
Lord of the Rings.
But I haven't felt that way for a new thing. Like I felt
right.
I in fits and starts, I've kind of felt that for The Witcher.
Yeah, but like barely, just like on an aesthetic level.
But I felt that for the books.
Yeah,
I really liked what we read of the books.
See, I didn't even feel that. I was like, okay, this is fun.
No, I'm saying I really liked the books, but not like this.
Okay, yeah.
And this hit me differently, and I loved that feeling of falling in love with a new world.
Yes.
This is a long movie. This is, like I think, a full 2.5 hour movie. And I was overwhelmed by the story of it. There was so much to introduce. I know the book has tons of exposition. There's like
I
should there are a ton of systems.
I've read the first 50 pages of the book. I guess I should have mentioned that. I stopped because I was just not in the mood to read such a wide scale epic story at that time while I'm reading Lord of the Rings. Like I just didn't want to do it. But I did enjoy it and would like to go back. And
the movie did a great job with urgency. I think all of his movies do that. But even more than that, there was a passion to this. almost a confidence. It felt like a friend who was really excited to tell you a story using hand gestures and eye contact. Like there was just such enthusiasm and passion for this story, and it made me almost retroactively enjoy other genre things less that didn't have that little divine spark that I really got from this adaptation. It has, and this is my little sales pitch too, if you haven't seen this movie, dear God, go watch it. It has fantastic action, powerful, rich characters, stunning scenery, and just confidence. And the confidence you can see in the huge action set pieces, but also in the quiet moments. There are lingering shots of local wildlife and weather effects, and every establishing shot of this main planet that we're on is just gorgeous and engrossing. There's so much going on here the whole time. And if you liked Game of Thrones, there's geopolitics and intrigue, power struggles, power vacuums, mentors and grudges. If you like Harry Potter, if you like Lord of the Rings, it's a sprawling magical world. The scale is ever increasing. It really was awe-inspiring, even on a home TV. It was incredible.
I know, like the costume design, the production design, like it was so beautifully done.
And it was one of those movies where they were firing on all cylinders like that, where you noticed every costume, you noticed every weird ship. It didn't just feel like, oh, there's another hunk of metal. It was...
it wasn't just, okay, this is like believably in space in the future. It was like, I believe that this world exists. Like it is so tangible, and so much of it is based in different cultures, which I find, and I know that's true to how the books are as well. I read that, like there's a lot of like Middle Eastern Islamic culture in there, and then there's like samurai Mongolian fighting style.
And the author was a Buddhist. So there's some of that in there too.
That's interesting. Yeah, and then of course you have Western culture in there as well, especially with like the Shakespearean style political stuff. And there's a duke, and that's very Western. Right. But there was such a mix of like, oh, I recognize that as being like vaguely Islamic, or that looks like vaguely Chinese, or that looks sort of like Icelandic Viking.
There was so much to dig into. Like it was a ruthlessly creative movie. And the best part, I think it got from Star Wars, because everyone seems to copy the wrong things from what's popular. I think Marvel movies had a good conversational tenor or flow, where there was a jokey kind of volley where everyone was quippy. And I think that works for like 2 Iron Man movies, because you have Robert Downey Jr. But then when that becomes the formula for 25 movies, and then everyone who wants to make a movie that's like a Marvel movie, then the audiences start to resent it because it's too familiar, because it's too predictable. But then people think, well, that's the formula, so I have to do that, and then I'll make $1 billion.
So painful.
The thing that this movie, or the lesson that this movie seemed to take from Star Wars for me, is that sense of inertia. It's not about how big the world is. It's not about how quippy the dialogue is. It's not about how shiny the lightsabers can be. It's this sense of inertia where you are immediately thrown into this huge living world, but it does not stop to explain itself to you. It keeps moving, and you are carried along for the ride. Like, I know I was missing names and references this first viewing, but I caught enough to know what was happening. And being a visual medium, I know what characters look like.
And like there are certainly moments, especially at the beginning, that are just straight up exposition, but it's doing it as the plot is moving on, as you're learning about, okay, who are our main characters, where are we? Like it's done very well, because it's a lot to explain. Like when you're not in a book where the narrator can just explain for pages and pages what's going on, to have exposition done in a pretty organic way is very hard to do and is very impressive. And I really admired that. I will say, we were watching with my sister, and she always watches with captions, which we don't normally do, but we watched with captions. That did help a lot. With knowing names and stuff.
It also helped because the movie was mixed for a different setting. But the thing I look for in these kind of adaptations or huge franchise movies, because I think they're frequently fumbled now or bastardized. I look for absolute respect and love for the original property. And I've read about Denis Villeneuve. I mean, I trusted him anyway. And he said he did Arrival and Blade Runner to get his sci-fi chops up to the point where he could do this.
Which is so cool.
Because he read Dune when he was 12, and this has been his dream to do this.
So cute.
That's all I need.
Right.
Like, I'm okay with Peter Jackson changing stuff from Lord of the Rings because I believe there's a concrete vision there, an absolute respect for Tolkien.
Exactly.
But then he interpolates things and transforms them for a different medium and occasionally changes an interpretation.
Right.
But at the baseline, there is a love for the thing you're adapting.
Right.
And it doesn't feel like you're trying to tag graffiti on something and make it your own. You are adapting something.
Yes. And I've only read like 50 pages of his multi-book series, but even from that, I can tell there's a respect for the source material.
Yeah, and one of my favorite things, I think Game of Thrones sort of evolved this conversation. One of my favorite casting decisions probably ever is having Sean Bean be the lead of the first season of Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Because it symbolically and I think in a very literal sense for the audience, it means that you are handing off the baton.
Yeah.
It lends it an authenticity and almost wears the inspiration and the influence directly on its sleeve.
Right.
Where you can be the next in that line of cultural succession.
So do you think that's what's happening with Oscar Isaac here?
And Jason Momoa.
Oh, yeah.
Because this movie is, I mean, the pitch, the comps, if you will, like when I'm pitching stories to literary agents or journals, they always want X meets Y.
Yeah.
Like how
Game
can
of
you,
Thrones meets House of Cards.
How can you quickly, easily summarize your thing so people can be interested in it? Because they're going to fall asleep listening to the pitch for your story.
Yeah.
They need to be hooked by the thing they already love.
And the thing that is already making money.
It's annoying and I hate it, but it's how it works.
Yeah.
This movie is, for all intents and purposes, Lord of the Rings meets Game of Thrones with Star Wars in there. Like,
yeah.
But
Lord of the Rings meets Game of Thrones in space.
But nailing it down more particularly, this movie is Star Wars with Game of Thrones. It's the Star Wars setting with Game of Thrones style, bleak morality and politics.
And adult
So you have
themes,
you have one of the lead actors from Star Wars in there, and you have one of the lead actors from Game of Thrones in there.
Yeah.
That passes the baton. It signals properly to the audience. And then, with both of those characters, you make some decisions that set the tone for this new world.
Yeah.
I was really impressed by the cast. I mean, they both also killed it in their roles.
Yeah.
But I thought that was a really good stroke of like messaging to the audience.
Sure. Yeah. No, I thought that worked really well. Do you want to talk about Chalamet?
I don't have anything to say about him.
I don't have a ton. I thought he was really good.
He's great.
He's such an interesting looking guy. And I like that they didn't say how old he was, right? They don't say how old he is. So it's like I think in the book, he's supposed to be 15. I think in reality, he was 23 when they filmed this. But I like him being like ambiguous in age because in this like totally different world so far in the future, you know, our 23 may not be there at 23, you know. I thought he was so like interesting to watch. He's really good at acting without speaking because I mean, he talks, but he doesn't talk a whole lot. There's a lot of like just still shots of him thinking or taking in information or dreaming, and you still learn a lot about his character. I really liked him as a lead, especially when you compare it to something like Game of Thrones where there isn't a true main character except maybe in the first season. So that's like a change there, but I mean, like way cooler than Luke Skywalker. Like,
and
sorry, but he was.
My favorite role I've seen him in before this is Beautiful Boy.
Yeah.
The Amazon movie where he played a character going through awful drug addiction. And he was so intense and expressive throughout that performance. I kind of liked seeing him in a more restrained character.
Totally. Because same with like in Little Women, he played Laurie. He was a really like emotional, outspoken, not dramatic. That sounds negative, but he was a sensitive character. And here he's a lot more reserved.
That capacity is still there. I would say he's emoting just as much in this role, but it's in such a subdued way where it's just through minor facial adjustments. It's extremely intricate acting.
Yeah.
But he did a great job. I really loved watching him. And I believed all of it.
Totally.
Which, I mean, I do a Lord of the Rings podcast. I'm down to believe any of it. But with a whole new world, having a believable core to anchor an audience through all these weird introductions and characters.
Well, and that's something I struggle with a lot with sci-fi. Like in fantasy, it's always, you know, you can just justify anything with magic. And like you just believe that because it's magic. In sci-fi, it's like it feels like it has to be based in something more real, like in real physics and real science. And so like in Star Wars, for example, I have a hard time believing a lot of what's going on in terms of like the technology and the the things they're able to do, like, you know, going into hyper speed and whatever. I mean, it's cool and fun, but I don't believe it the way that I believe the dragons in Game of Thrones. But here I found myself believing all the technology, and like, I'm not a scientist, so like maybe this is nothing, but like I believed all the technology, the suits that they wear that I was referring to earlier, whether in the sand, like I found it all very believable, and it felt tangible, and I liked that a lot.
And the technological advancements, they were interesting, and the design for all of it was gorgeous, but that wasn't the point of it. It wasn't. Yeah. This is not like a speculative fiction story or a what-if story.
And it's not like true sci-fi, which like the root of true sci-fi is about technology and science.
I don't know enough about the genre to make that declaration.
That's as much as I know, and that's why
I think there's like... I don't know. I know that's more complicated.
Yeah, this is really fantasy with a sci-fi setting. That's what this is. Like in terms of like the themes and the types of story that's being told here, it's really fantasy just with a futuristic setting versus a
if you go back to
setting.
George Lucas, he called Star Wars space fantasy.
Yeah, that's what this is.
Is that what you're kind of talking
about? That's what I
mean.
Yeah.
But the point isn't like, what if we had a suit that could glow red when you get hit? Like,
yeah, it's not about that.
The movie is, as much as it's exposing all of these new creative things you've never seen or thought about, it's about 1,000 larger themes, and you're constantly thinking about those ideas is throwing out. There's colonialism, resource extraction or exploitation.
Yeah.
A ton about religion, indigenous peoples, the future of technology, class warfare, wealth redistribution, family tension, legacy, expectations.
Yeah.
That's the stuff you're feeding on. And then there'll be a moment of like, oh, look, that little spy bullet is also like a bug and it's flying around. And then he caught it. And like, there's that, but that is never the overarching point of the story.
It's never about the shield. It's about the reason they're using the shields. Yeah, exactly.
Which is another great mistake to avoid in like modern franchises.
Sure, yeah. No, it was really good. I loved this movie.
And all of those topics, it hit with nuance. And
exactly. I was going to say, like, because I was hinting at this earlier with Star Wars, like, when they talk about the Empire taking over everything, like that's a very clear black and white way to look at something like colonialism or imperialism, I guess is really correct there, imperialism. But this is so much more complex, and it digs into like all the different elements of that and what that looks like and all the different factors that are at play. And I'm not saying that it's like saying, what if imperialism was good? Like, it's not saying that, but it's just talking about how complex all of that actually is. It's not as simple as bad guys and good guys.
And I mean, you and I were having a conversation the other day about villains, and I was talking about, I think we were talking about like the Batman and the Joker, and I was saying the Joker can never be really bad. Like he can vaguely do anarchic, destructive things, but I mean, if Gotham is New York, you can never have the Joker do 9/11.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
that'd be a bit too much.
There's a ceiling on how villainous you can actually be.
Yeah, I see.
Because it still has to be able to sell to kids. Because it's still a mascot for a company now owned by AT&T.
Well, and because he has to keep doing bad stuff for 30 more years while we keep writing new stories and selling them. Yeah.
But in this movie, not only were the villains really villainous.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
But the heroes were murky. And they took great amounts of time, I would say, to develop the characters who presented as gray. Yeah. They would do something really bad, and then there would be like waves of redemption to complicate that. And it didn't feel like everyone had to be murky, like it's a post-anti-hero.
Yeah, it wasn't quite on the Game of Thrones level of ambiguous, icky characters. It wasn't quite that far.
And even as it played with hot topics or ideas or the oil metaphor throughout the thing, it never felt like the story, the new proper nouns and names and mythologies, it never felt like that was a fig leaf so the author could talk about oil in the Middle East.
It didn't feel like an allegory.
The mythology is the immersion. in these stories. And I think that's missed too. It becomes like, oh, this is a good vehicle to mask our social commentary.
Right. That's not what it was.
This was not a movie about Trump.
Yeah, right. In the same way that the world is built around different, like, real recognizable cultures and histories, also like the same with what you're saying, like spice being similar to oil, and like themes of like imperialism, like all of that is familiar to us, and that's why we can understand the story so well, not in a allegorical way, just in a, this is a recognizable concept for me, and so I'm connecting to and attaching to this story.
And I believe the author confirmed that was what he was doing with all that.
Yeah, love that.
Let's talk about the villains a little, if we talked about the hero.
Okay.
So creature design is big for me in these kind of movies. Lord of the Rings has the Nazgul. I'm talking about villains here. Lord of the Rings has the Nazgul, which I still think are probably the coolest looking bad guys, with those weird wiggly swords and the perfect like
and
cape and the horses and all of that.
Yeah, they're very cool.
Star Wars has Darth Vader, which is probably the best looking villain ever.
I wouldn't say so, but he's cool.
Come on.
He's iconic. I wouldn't say he's the
breathing,
looking.
the helmet, the lightsaber, the stuff. Oh, come on.
It's okay.
Well,
he's okay.
Some of you weren't little boys, and it shows. Game of Thrones
No, I was just watching Disney. That's all I was watching.
Game of Thrones
Although Star Wars is now Disney, so I guess joke's on me. Sorry. Continue.
Game of Thrones has the White Walkers, and Harry Potter has Voldemort. All great, like intimidating, but also fascinating, cool creature design. Like you're scared of them, but you also want them on a t-shirt.
Yeah.
It's that perfect like middle ground where all the Funko Pops are sold. That's the sweet spot.
Yeah.
And Dune has the sandworm.
Oh my God, they're so cool. They're so cool. I love these things. I'm kind of mad that because you tend to not watch trailers anymore. Like you really
if
avoid
I can help
them
it, yeah.
Because you just want to be fully surprised when you watch it. I was like so hyped for this movie, and I watched this trailer, when it came out like 2 years ago or whenever that was. And I remember seeing there's a great shot of the sandworm in the trailer, and I was like, that looks so cool. And I'm kind of bummed that my first time seeing it like that wasn't in the movie.
But the movie also teases you a lot before you get a good shot of the
yeah,
sandworm.
it's very like Smaug in The Hobbit. Like you don't see it for a while.
But and I think it's really important with this kind of creature design. They know it's cool.
Oh yeah.
And they know how to freak you out with the teeth and the like it's swimming in the sand, and you see all the sand getting like upset and moving over top of it. They know how to build that, and the reveal was fantastic.
It was.
But the other thing I was really impressed with, they don't show the true antagonist. They talk about an emperor
I know.
throughout this movie, and
we don't see him.
We don't get his name.
No,
we
he's just
say
called the emperor.
We don't even get a tease like seeing Gollum's eyes in the distance at the end of the movie.
It is so vague, like so much so that I was like, did we see him and I missed it? But no, we didn't. Like, again, unless it was that guy at the beginning, but I don't think it was. I think he was like, a spokes guy.
Right.
Spokesman.
And I feel like I wouldn't understand this as well a couple years ago. But now when I see that, I think of the Hitchcock ideal of it's scarier to hear the bad guy dragging the axe than to see him.
Yes.
Like
right.
the fact that we see people terrified of this figure that we don't get to know anything about.
Yeah.
That's how powerful he is, which really starts to feel like Sauron. But also...
Sorry. Continue.
No, you're good. But
continue.
when we were on the plane to the honeymoon, I read the first part of a manga adaptation of the H.P. Lovecraft book At the Mountains of Madness. And Lovecraft, he exists now as an adjective because it changed horror so much. It changed creature design, all the John Carpenter stuff we love. There's so much buildup and flirtation and suggestion that this big bad, I don't know if it's a plant or if it's a weird... googly monster or like what, or if it's a sandworm, like this huge celestial being that you don't understand, that operates on the levels of gods and planets, that just annihilates rooms full of people. And you never get the full shot of like Michael Myers stabbing people over and over again.
Yeah.
It's much more mysterious and restrained as a villain, and it's all about the aura of how freaky this thing is and how the buildup is the point of the villain.
Yeah.
This bad guy, as much as we talked about the sandworms, the Emperor makes sense to me here as like a Lovecraft-style villain.
That's nice. Yeah, well, and if you want to talk about Tolkien crossovers, like that's so much like Sauron. We never get to see Sauron. We don't know a whole lot about him, and we learn more as the story goes on, but our constant complaint has been, I want more about this villain.
Right.
And in the same way that Saruman is our like stand-in villain for a while in the story, that's what the Baron is here in Dune.
And the Baron is scary in the same way the Nazgul are, because for a long time they're the closest we get to Sauron.
Yeah.
And they're freaky looking. The Baron is extremely freaky looking.
Yeah.
And then when he moves, he like floats really high up.
Yeah, he's gross.
He's extremely effective and intimidating. So we in our minds, like, we have to do some of the math in our heads. Like, if this guy is really scary, but then there's this other guy, I can't even imagine how much more scary he is. And that's really effective.
Yeah, he's the mini boss before you get to the main boss.
But in a movie that, like, gives your imagination so much to play with, I love that there's still the time put in to engage your imagination and, like, give you homework.
Yeah,
Give you something to think about, give you a new puzzle to solve. That's like half of why I'm excited to see the next one.
It's also right. It's so bold because this is called part 1. It's not like this is Dune 1 and the next one is Dune 2. Like, they have split up the first book into like 2 parts. So this is part 1, and when they made this, part 2 was not yet greenlit. So
for the year it was delayed, part 2 wasn't greenlit.
Yeah, and so like. And so many people have said this before who have reviewed the movie, and I feel the same way. Without part 2, this movie doesn't really work. And I don't mean that like I won't like it until I see part 2. I just mean that it's not a complete story. Like, there's still so much more that has to happen for it to feel satisfying. I mean, it still feels satisfying as a movie, but it relies so heavily on that part 2. And it's so ballsy to like make this not knowing if you're going to have part 2. Like what a way to have confidence in your own story.
Oh yeah, no, that confidence throughout all of Villeneuve's movies, that's not an accident, right?
Yeah,
he's got to know at this point.
Yeah, so I'm so excited for part 2, obviously, just, you know, because like we said, this world is so cool and so fun, but also just to see how it all comes together and works as like a duology. It's very cool.
Yeah, we get to see more of this world with this curator we trust.
Exactly.
So speaking of curators we trust, Paramount's been trying to get this movie made since 2007.
Wow.
And at one point, Peter Jackson expressed a desire to
do
a version of it.
Nice.
Obviously, that didn't happen.
I feel like, I don't know if that would have worked.
Yeah, I don't know. But Villeneuve is kind of doing the same thing from the looks of it. I mean, I don't know the source material, but I loved Peter Jackson before I read Tolkien. There's just that same passion, that same love of the world that's so palpable in this. But let's talk about Tolkien.
Okay.
Who... Of course, this book came out in 1965. Tolkien didn't die till, I think, 1974.
That sounds
so
right.
He had some time. And he was obviously on top of genre fiction that followed his.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So he talked about Dune exactly once in his life, and it was in a letter to a friend, which, of course, was then released as, you know, everything he ever touched with a pen has come out since.
Yes, right.
So he said this to a guy. He said, "Thank you for sending me a copy of Dune. It is impossible for an author still writing to be fair to another author working along similar lines. At least I find it so. In fact, I dislike Dune with some intensity.
Oh, no!
And in that unfortunate case, it is much the best and fairest to another author to keep silent and refuse to comment."
Oh, no. That's all he said?
Yes.
Oh, my God.
Dislike Dune with some intensity.
I wonder why. And it's hard for me. I mean, I can't really compare because, again, I've only read like 50 pages of that book, so I can't really compare their like styles.
Well, this is what the rest of my notes are on.
Okay.
Trying to figure out why.
Yeah.
So, first blush, I think it makes sense, mainly just in worldview, because Dune is so much more Succession than it is The Hobbit.
It's a bit bleaker, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It is a incredibly dark, bleak, and fundamentally treacherous world.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There is... I guess there are real heroes. Mm-hmm. I mean, they die immediately. But mostly it's like there are occasional reluctant do-gooders and attempted heroes, and they die too. But there is no Samwise Gamgee.
Yeah, there's no like purely good. I mean, Paul is our clear protagonist, good guy, but even still...
He's not a hero.
No, and he's just kind of this awkward, skinny kid.
No, and... I noticed this in some of the quieter points of the movie where I could like swallow and reflect and absorb and like begin to reflect on all this. Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, all of these Tolkien stories, they are journeys. There is one quest, and we will struggle along the way.
Yes, it's always about a quest. Yeah.
After the twist that comes about halfway through Dune, it is utterly about survival. And there is no larger quest. It's literally just staying alive.
Yeah, there's not even a journey. It's, I'm going to go to Arrakis in a few weeks, and then he's at Arrakis.
Right.
Like, there's no, like, getting to Arrakis. Like, there's none of that.
And I can see Tolkien disliking that. As
Sure.
much as I can see him having a distaste for that, what he might call cynical worldview.
Sure. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't call Tolkien's worldview, like, it's not, like, sugar-coated. Like,
No,
he's still, like,
but
talking
it's
about
hopeful.
bleak. It's hopeful.
That's what I meant.
That's true. He does talk a lot about hope and, like,
Right.
the lack of it and how do we get it back. This isn't so much about that. So I guess that's true.
I also think when Tolkien wrote a ton about how much he hated allegories, I think the Middle East oil thing might have been a little too on the nose for him.
Oh, you think you thought it was... Okay, yeah, that's
Yeah.
fair. I mean, yeah, I don't know how obvious or overt it is in the books, so, but you're right, it could be a bit more.
People online have also
Yeah.
said that Herbert's prose is a lot less lyrical.
Yes, I will.
And inspired.
I did note that in
Yeah.
the 50 pages that I read. It wasn't bad. It was just not... Like, Tolkien can write really beautifully, and I did not find Herbert to be the same.
But I mean, I found a lot of comparisons, favorable comparisons between Dune and Lord of the Rings. And there were moments of, like, genuine lessons
Yeah.
in this that I found resonated with me a lot. I'm not saying that art has to have any moments of inspiration. I don't like things that just are morality plays. I think
Sure.
that's really not art at some point.
Yeah.
It's just like lecturing, staring into the camera. But there's a moment where one of Paul's mentors, he's like training him to fight, and Paul says he's not in the mood to fight, and the guy like basically tries to beat the shit out of him.
Yeah, he's like,
he just
your
starts,
mood?
he starts the training session. He's like, it's not about mood. You
Yeah.
just do it when you have to do it.
Yeah.
And I vibed hard with that. I loved that.
Yeah.
And I appreciated that as a bit of advice, or maybe like, it's not that the author is cynical and detached from the world. It's that he's positing a world that is negative and treacherous and rough and unfair.
Yeah, and how do you deal
But
with
within
that?
there are people who are trying to be fair. And
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of how I view the world. That inherently the world has no concept of fairness.
No.
I mean, watch anything on National Geographic where the cute animals get annihilated by the ones with all the teeth.
Yeah.
There's not fairness there. But people can aspire to fairness. In the same way nations can aspire to greatness and to unity. And I liked having a character voice that. Like, yeah, the world's shit sometimes,
Yeah.
but let's try to be better. I thought that was a great... Because then you're pushing against the tide. Then there's hope. Then there's a quest.
Yeah.
And nobility in this story. And I really liked
Yeah.
that the movie brought that to the surface for a moment, because it gave me something to hold on to in the next brutal hour of the movie.
Yeah, that's nice. I like that a lot.
So I do think there is... I mean, it's sort of a chicken and the egg situation at this point. There are a lot of great similarities between this and Lord of the Rings, but I can also obviously see people having great disdain for one or the other.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I think, again, in terms of like aesthetics, Lord of the Rings is much more my jam. But in terms of like touching on serious adult themes in a nuanced way, I think this has done it a bit better.
As far as the aesthetics of the movie, this is as beautiful as anything in Lord of the Rings.
I don't even mean beauty. I just mean in terms of like preference. Like I like like hobbits and elves and bows and arrows versus spaceships. You know?
Sure, yeah.
But again, these spaceships were very cool and I liked them a lot. So
Yeah, I adored this and I want more.